Thank you, everybody, for coming. This gentleman here doesn't need an introduction, Don Thorson. We're excited to have him here, and here he is.
All right.
Well, this was billed as a family history and oil field history, so we'll start in with my family. Both my parents were first generation Norwegian here. Neither of them spoke English until they got into grade school.
Can you hear him?
Start with mother. She was born in Wisconsin, and she had her usual problems as growing up. They moved to Denver in about the early 20s, and they had several tragedies. Mother had both diphtheria and scarlet fever, and finally Spanish flu in 1918, which she survived all of those. She was going to attend high school, and her mother told her, well, I can't afford to send you because I've got to take care of her father died when she was just about to go into high school. And her mother became a domestic housekeeper. She had done some sewing, but she decided that she was too tense for that. So mother went, she said, well, I'll send you to secretarial school. And mother went to school. She learned shorthand and typing, and she was very good at both. In fact, when she lived in Osage years later, she was still using shorthand, and I think she used it up, she recognized it up until the time she died. It was strange. She kept books for Dad most of that time. She went to school, and the instructor at the school told her, well, you're ready to go and look for a job, but don't ask for more than $10 a day, or now a month, $10 a month, a week, excuse me. $10 a week, I'll get it straight. And she was really happy when the guy offered her 12. And she must have been doing a good job because she had a number of advances, and she was finally making $50 a month. Her mother was taking care of everything, and her brother was born. She was about 10 years younger than her, and she wanted to send him. She sent him to a school, and he was able to go to kind of a trade school, high school. But he was very intelligent, and her mother had decided that he needed to go to college. And she went out to Oakland, California, and put him in school out there. And mother was still sending money, and moved out there, in fact, shortly before she and Dad were married. Now with Dad, he was born in Milan, Minnesota, and when he was about a year old or less, they moved to North Dakota. And his dad had taken out a claim on a farm there, homesteaded. And they also had an adjacent family, the Graves family, whom my grandfather had married one of their daughters. They were, I remember going up there when we were very young, and the Graves family lived across we called it the slough, which was a big, at that time, a dry lake, but it would periodically get water in it and fill up water. So Dad had the unique experience of being knocked out by lightning 3 times in his life. one time when he was just about a year old, his grandmother was holding him by the stove. They had the old-fashioned wood stove, and the lightning hit the house. It was a bad storm and knocked him out completely. The second time he was out disking with the team, and the clouds were coming up, so he decided he better get back to the house. And he went by a certain rock, and the lightning hit that rock, and it was so close that knocked him out. Well, it wasn't too severe. He recovered and went back out that same day, and another storm came and hit that same rock as he was coming home. So it does strike in two places at once. Dad learned English when he went to grade school, and he got a job from the teacher to go and start the fire. He lived about a mile and a half away, and it was a little one-room school, and he'd get on his pony and go down and start the fire going. Well, he got through grade school, and time for high school. Well, he lived about 10 miles from town, which in North Dakota in that time, in the teens, he was born in '02, and so this was probably in about 12 or 14. Why, there was a lot of snow up there, and it was not convenient for him to get to high school. Plus the fact that he'd had pneumonia when he was a kid, and his lungs were not as good as they should have been, and the doctor told him, well, you need to get off the farm because the dust and everything is very hard on you. So he went to Fargo when he was 16, and when he went to business school, and they had passed a law up there that all of the grain elevator operators had to take arithmetic, because the farmers and the ranchers and the farmers and the grain elevator people, weren't too up on arithmetic. So Dad was teaching that when he was 18, but he still had a problem with his breathing. The doctor told her, you better get out west. Well, his brother Adolph, whom a lot of you would know, had been out to Wyoming and just looking around, and he stopped in Casper and told Dad about it, of course. And so when they would come from North Dakota Dad had a job in Greeley, Colorado, teaching. But he didn't want to give up that first month's wages for them finding him the job. So he got off the train in Casper, and I think about 21 or 22 would have been. He had $50 in his pocket, and he found a rooming house where he could stay. His first job was collecting from the newspaper, and there was a guy by the name of Brooks there who was president of the bank. He went up to his house, and his wife answered the door, and she was very insulted that Dad did not know that he was the president of the bank there, and he should know that, and he paid the bills at his bank. Well, Dad slipped on some ice one time and fell and hurt a hip or leg, and he was off for a couple of weeks. And when he got back, why, the job wasn't there. Somebody else had it. Well, because of his training in business college, he got a job with an accountant. He was just setting up a company there. Well, he was still had a problem with his lungs and breathing that told him you should get outside. Well, there was a pipeline being built from Midwest into for the refinery, and he got a job there. And he had some good friends there, and he had met Mother in church. They both went to the Lutheran church, and the pastor had them teaching Sunday school. Well, that kind of led to a brief or a de facto courtship, and when Dad would they be out on the line at this camp where he would take a train. They could take a train into Casper and get back on a weekend and get back in time to go to work. Well, they were screwing 8-inch screw pipeline together, and Delbert would know what that is, trying to thread 8-inch pipe. It takes a very talented crew to do that because they have to stab it. The stabber's the guy that's the key to everything, and then everything was hand-tonged in those days. They'd have a long pole with a rope on it, and it would wrap around the pipe, and they'd just keep bringing it tighter and tighter. Well, Dad must have showed up pretty good, because about that time the Osage field had been discovered, and the pipeline company had a loading dock over there. There wasn't any refineries in the country then, and they had a loading dock out at Clay Spur. And I remember the name of the guy out there that was taking care of that. His name was Monahan. I think it was Paul, I don't know. Anyway, they sent Dad over there to supervise that. Well, the Osage field was a prolific field for a short time. Those wells would come in, they were gas drive, and they'd come in really good, for the initially, and it was shallow. Everything was probably under 1,000 feet at the time. So Dad was supervising that, and a group of people formed a trust called the Osage Trust. And there's 5 of them, and they hired Dad to be their superintendent. Well, I don't know what made him think he knew anything about the oil business, because he did, but he was a good learner, and he was running that company from on the field standpoint. And in the meantime, he had decided that he didn't like single life, and Mother kind of the same way. She was out in Oakland, and so they proposed and agreed to get married out there. So Dad went out for the wedding, and he had bought a new Chrysler coupe, and he said that was Mother's car. So they were married out there, and one of the jokes Mother always told was that they tied tin cans on their car, but they also had a great big shoe that somebody had found. And when they checked into the hotel that night, well, here was that shoe dragging behind the car. Well, they made it back, and I've got to say Dad's persuasive ability showed up then pretty drastically. Here he talked this young lady who'd lived in the city all of her life with the accoutrements of the city, the running water and streets and everything, into coming and living in a tar paper shack. It was quite crowded. Mother said that even you had to climb over the bed to make it. It was that small. So they managed to get a couple other houses put together. The oil field camp at that time was 3 houses, and it was common to be for the companies to make accommodations for the people, because they had to be there where they could work. And this was out in the old Osage field, And some of you may remember or know where Oil City was. Oil City was across it wasn't a highway then, it was just a dirt road, and very muddy at times. But Oil City was a sizable little establishment. There's a lot of the Townsends out there, and the Teaslings, and Updikes, several other families. The Juliuses were there. I always remember there was a Julius who was, they said he was blind, but he wasn't totally blind, but he was a good mechanic. And he would work on his cars. He could do it by feel. And we lived on the north side of that road, and Oil City was on the south side. But everybody had to go to Osage for the normal small town stuff. Rumor has it that there were 5,000 people living there at one time, but that's a pretty wild rumor, but who knows? Because when these fields would boom, they would really boom. So anyway, they lived there and they got things pretty well under control. And I was born in 33. Mother decided that there was, at her age, she was 31, that she should go to down to Boulder, where her mother had moved back to, because her brother was in college in Boulder. And she decided to go down there when I was born, and she said she had a very difficult time. And Newcastle was really they had a hospital of sorts. Acord was the people's name that had their house was I don't know how many bed hospitals, but it was what worked in town. Well, everything was going along reasonably well for that time of the year of history. And we had a chow dog, which are not noted for their friendliness. And this chow really hated cats. Well, Mother and one of the women out there were visiting, and this dog saw a cat, and it took out after it and roughed it up pretty bad. Mother was always very sensitive to animals. And so in those days, a lot of people had a root cellar. I don't know how many of you know what a root cellar is, but it was a underground storage for potatoes, onions, carrots, turnips, you name it. You could keep them down there for the winter. And some of the people had natural gas in those for a lamp, for light. Well, Dad had told everybody to take out that gas. You don't want it in there, because you start lighting things with natural gas and you're looking for trouble. Well, this cellar where they had put this cat on the top step where it could recover, my Mother told Dad about it, and he went over to check on it, and opened the door and couldn't find the cat. So we thought, well, I better go down and see if I can find it. And he lit a match and blew him out of there. I was 3 years old. I can remember Ben Strickling, Delbert's father, coming over and taking Dad down to the hospital. And that was a real tragedy. That, Dad was very severely burned on his arms, particularly, and also his face. And they had a treatment then called Amertan, which was, you put it on third-degree burns and it became just like a leather covering. But it was also, with all that third-degree burn, so sensitive that nobody could even touch Dad. Well, after, I think it was about a month, he was in the hospital. And he came back, but he wanted to get out and work. Well, how was he going to do that? His hands were bandaged up where he couldn't even close them. And he had the steering wheel wrapped up, but he was driving an international pickup. Well, in those days, the 4-speed pickups had a little toggle on the gear shift to go into reverse. And the other thing is they had a key that you had to turn on. Generally, they had a foot starter. And so that became my job when I was 3 years old. And they used to say that I used to shift gears for Dad. Well, I don't know if I could probably put it into 1 or 2 gears, but after he got it running, he could probably push it. But when it comes to reverse, I always had to lift that little trigger up and pull it over and shift it down into reverse. But as all the wounds do, it eventually healed. But his skin was scarred for the rest of his life. When they come to the oil field, why, in those days, most of the drilling was done from a standard derrick. Now, you don't see any standard derricks anymore. That's a 4-legged wooden derrick. It's quite a trade building a derrick. You had crews that would go along, and they were rig builders. And the legs were built, they were not posts going up, they were planks, like 2x6s, 2x8s, nailed together to make a timber. And they'd splice them together and brace them. They knew all how to brace them. They kind of had a blueprint to go by, and part of it was just what looked right. You know, I've come to kind of tease some people. They say, well, what kind of engineering did you use for that? And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, I've got one method I always use. It looks about right. You've got to build things that look right, or they probably won't be right. That's kind of a thought I've always gone by. But the common tool was a rig hatchet, which Delbert knows exactly what I'm talking about. It was a long-handled hatchet with a serrated head on it. And these guys could build that derrick without the only thing they probably had was a rope to bring the boards up. And they'd keep building up until they got the height they wanted. Now the drilling was done with a method called cable tools. I was surprised. I was with some people, long-time oil people, and I mentioned cable tools, and what's cable tools? They didn't have any idea what cable tools were, because everything's done with rotary. Well, cable tools are a 3 or 4 piece of equipment that was used on the rigs. You had your drilling line, which was probably a 3/4 to 7/8 line, depending on how deep you were going. And there was a rope socket that hooked to the drilling line. And you had to run a cable in there and pour liquid lead around it, and that's called pouring a socket. Well, then on the rope socket, you had a stem. A stem was a long piece of steel with threads on both ends, one male sticking up and the female, which had fit into the rope socket. And then underneath the stem, you had the jars. And the jars were 2 pieces of steel that were forged, and they would work like this, so that you could get the action when you pull up, and it would go down and the stem would hit down. And then you had a bit, which had a certain head on it that was flared out, and your rigs always had a forge on the floor. And when you had 2 bits, generally, the size you were drilling, and you'd keep one in the forge all the time because it takes it that long to heat up and get red hot. And then you'd have two guys with 14 or 16 pound sledgehammers would beat the bit into the shape they wanted it, kind of a wedge shape, and then it became a real skill to get a good bit. And so you could change bits as one got dull, while you could put the new ones in. And this was all screwed together with what was called a jack and circle. You had a half circle which had teeth on it. And then you had a jack that would fit that half circle. And you had two big steel wrenches that would, all of these tools had a square on them that would take the wrenches. And they would tighten them up as much as they could by hand, but you had to get them really tight so that they didn't come unscrewed when you were drilling. Now the rig had sometimes you had a single drum rig, or you could have two drums. The main drum was a bull wheel, and that was where most of your power went to. But then you had a second line with sand drive, which carried the baler. When you would drill, you'd drill down to where you'd made a sufficient amount of hole, several feet. The driller would stand there with his hand on the cable, and he could tell when he was getting hit in bottom and wasn't making any hole. As long as it would hit up a little bit higher than where he thought, he would keep letting off a little. That is the connection between the cable and the walking beam. The walking beam was, you've seen pictures of them, that the beam that goes like this all the time. It runs off from an eccentric on the shaft, and that's what would spud your bit into the hole. And when he sensed that it wasn't making any hole anymore, well, you'd run the baler in. The baler was a tube about smaller than what your hole was drilling, and it had a dart on the bottom of it. And it would go down, and when it hit that dart, would push up and would let the fluid come into that. And that's the way you brought the cuttings out. And you'd dump them out into the a basin that you had, that was a mud pit. And you could tell what formation. You get samples of your sand from on this that you were drilling into. That's the geologist could tell exactly where you were. The rig, I neglected to say, often had a one-cylinder, the early ones were steam. You had steam, which was from a boiler, and after the field got established, you would have natural gas, which you could pipe around to the well. But in the early ones, you probably used wood or coal to make your steam. And the steam rigs were really nice because they could throttle them and make everything smooth. Well, as you drilled down, why, bring up your samples, would keep getting the hole. Then when you got into the sand, why, you would go ahead and drill through it. Then you had to run casing. Now, in the present day, we drill right through the sand. We pump cement down the hole, up over the sand and everything as much as you want. But in those days, you would run down, and you had a shoe on the casing for the bottom of it, and you could dump cement down, and that's the way that was completed. You would run it down on the baler, fill it full of cement, and you'd have a stick on the end of the dart, so when it got to the bottom, but just before you got there, it would dump the cement out. And there was no Halliburton in those early days. Well, they were not here anyway. So that's the way the oil field was completed. Then you drill through the sand after you got the cement set, and you'd get down and make rat hole through the sand. And the early days, they'd shoot the wells with nitroglycerin. And sometimes they used dynamite, which is nitroglycerin absorbed into sawdust, or they would also have special shooters that come out with liquid nitroglycerin. And they would have they'd have a pickup with rubber suspension to carry the nitroglycerin, so it's not shocked anyway. Then you set that off, where you'd have if you would run that down on a wire line, and you generally had a cap on top of it that was set off by an impact. And for the impact, what you would do, you'd have a go devil, which would drop over the line and follow the line down until it hit the bottom, and boom. And I always wanted to be around when they'd shoot them, but Dad wouldn't let me be around when they had that nitroglycerin around. The other way that they would do it, they'd set a timer off. They'd have a timer that would go down and it would set off, given so much time. I can remember one time we were cleaning out a well after they'd shot it, and Dad says, well, here's part of the timer. Oh, that was a prized possession I had. Now, to get a little back more to the family side, you know, the old saying, monkey see, monkey do. Why, I thought I had to be a driller. Well, in those days, there was a lot of people had wind chargers. If they had electricity, you'd get 32 volts off from a wind charger. I'm sure they have about an 8-foot four-legged post and a wind charger that went on top of it. And they would have batteries, wet cell batteries that they would charge up, and that gave them electricity. It's not real common, but somehow or other, I got a hold of a derrick that wasn't being used. And, well, I had to do something with that. This is when I talk about this when I go to school. I'd say, when I was 6 years old, I was going to be a mechanical engineer, because I had grown up around all of the machinery and everything. Mother used to say that back in the days, the cable tool days, everybody had their string of tools, 2 or 3 strings. But sometimes you didn't have the exact thing you wanted, so somebody'd have to go, well, so-and-so's got one up here. Let's see if we can borrow that. Well, Dad would tell them, yeah, if they contacted him, he said, yeah, go to the camp and my wife will show you where it is. Well, Mother didn't know a thing about them, but I did. I knew all the terminology and everything when I was 6 years old. I didn't even learn not to step in a mud pit. It looked dry, but it was muddy underneath. And it's still a continuing problem with neophytes when they go to a drilling rig. So I would go out in the tool yard and show them where it was and what they needed.
In addition to the weekly printed version of the newsletter journal, we also promote our community and share important information on our award-winning website, newslj.com, and in our weekly email newsletter, Nuke Now. We also connect with readers through various social media platforms and invite you to check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can even take a look at a recent meeting of the City Council, School Board, or County Commission on our YouTube channel. We do hope that you will go to newslj.com and subscribe today, and we look forward to making all of our great content available to you. But regardless of your level of support, we thank you from the bottom of our hearts for doing your part to preserve a free and independent local press.
We had the company that finally bought a big truck. It's about like the 170 International. It wasn't International, it was red. And that truck was big red. And oh, I just loved to play in that truck. And most of the time they kept it in the garage. It was just for special uses. We didn't have gin trucks in those days. And Dad went later on, after I'd come back from the Army and everything, we'd be moving something around, and I said, well, we'll get a truck. Oh, he said, you guys, we used to do all that with jacks and skids. Well, what they meant was they'd use simplex jacks and jack something up, get it up high enough, you could get a truck under it, and then you get some rollers and you roll it onto the truck. And that's the way they moved iron in those days. There wasn't any of these gin trucks around. It was just hadn't been really thought of yet. So I had this derrick, and of course I had a wagon, and I'd have it to where I could lay the derrick down, and I had a trailer that fit behind my wagon, and I could move it. And I'd had a pulley, found a pulley that would run a rope over, and I found a piece of steel shaft of some kind, about, as I remember, about probably 24, 30 inches long. And I'd set that up, and I'd stand out there and I'd pull that rope up and down to drill the hole. And I even had a short piece of 3-inch pipe that I put up for casing, because I'd get down about 2-3 feet, you know. Well, Gordon Pauley, as a lot of you know who he was. He was a machinist in town, and he and Dad were very close friends. And I always said about Gordon, if he couldn't make it, you didn't need it. And so he saw what I was doing, and darn if he didn't make me a little bit about so long, and a baler to go with it, and I could drill these holes and use my bit and baler, and I'd actually get 3 feet deep or something like that. So it's always kind of, then I could figure, well, that hole's far enough, we've got to move over to the next hole. And I could lay them down, and this is about the time that the term jackknife come around for rotary rigs. And I thought, well, I'd make a jackknife out of this. Well, I don't remember getting that completed, but I had the idea for it anyway. So we had our couple of tragedies there in the field. Dad's brother came to work for him when he was about 20 years old, and he had 2 brothers beside Adolf. One of them died of spinal meningitis, and this younger one was out there working for him. And Beaver Creek has been known to flood in those old days quite profusely sometimes. And there was, on our lease, there was a bridge over Beaver Creek where you drive down across the bridge. And the bridge generally stayed there. Well, Len and one of the hands out there, Sam Gunderson, were going to cross that bridge. And Len said, I better walk out there and see if the bridge is still there. Well, he didn't know how to swim. He come from North Dakota, and it picked him up and carried him about a half mile downstream, but he drowned at that time. And that was a pretty severe shock. Well, Dad had an entrepreneur spirit to him, and there was a lease that came up for sale called the Lambie lease. It had 3 derricks on it, and they weren't making much oil, but Dad figured he could buy that. It was coming up at a sheriff's sale. It was $10,000. And Mother had had an accident in Casper on an elevator when she was riding up to work, and it dropped from the 3rd floor down to the 1st floor and broke her arm. Well, she got a settlement of $1,300 from the insurance company, and she took 1,000 of that and she invested it in the Standard Oil stock, and never, she just left it there. Well, Dad saw this lease, and he had known Charlie Martins for some time, and Charlie and he and Gordon were kind of a triumvirate. The 3 of them were very close friends. Our families were close. So Dad went to Charlie, and Charlie said, well, that stock's worth $5,000. And so Mother sold that to him for that. And Dad borrowed $5,000, so he had the money to buy this Lambie lease. And it was, I remember there was 3 derricks there, and they tore the derricks down, and all of the equipment that was there. I think he kept one well for it because it was making some oil. And about that time, a second lease came for sale. The Osage Trust owned the lease, and brother of one of the owners had an interest in it, but he wasn't very ambitious and wasn't taking good care of it. And so Dad thought, well, I can buy that. There were 5 wells making a barrel a day apiece. It had a central pump jack system, which was pretty common in the field those days. You'd have a large band wheel, probably 15 feet apart, wouldn't you say, Gilbert? Something like that.
Yeah.
And a single cylinder engine. It had a belt that would go clear around that thing and come back. And on this was an eccentric or a crank that would go around, and you'd hook cables to that crank. And you could run those cables out whatever direction you wanted to. Well, the cables would run a very simple jack that was called the Oklahoma jack. There was 2 kinds, Oklahoma, and what was the other one? I don't remember. But it was just they'd make them out of wood. They were timbers, and you'd have an arm on it, a 90-degree arm that would go back and forth like this. And on this end of it was a post that would go up to the walking beam, and so you'd get your pumping action, which you see on oil wells today. They have a electric motor. Most of them do. So Dad bought that, and about this same time when he bought this Lambie lease, there was 2 houses on that. Well, it was pretty isolated, and Mother didn't want to live out there in the oil field any longer, so they thought they'd move to Osage. And Dad was able to trade for half a block of land from the Nefses. Nefse owned a big part of Osage when he had been one of the first people up there. And so we built this house, which is still standing. Delmer and Jane Ann Slagle moved into it after we moved out. So they moved that to town. Well, there was a house mover, Ace Moore, moved the house for us, and Dad had a basement dug so that it could have crawl space underneath it, which is basically what it was crawl space. And we put that in there, just part ways up the hill, just right close to school. And we lived there for 18 years. It was in 1941. That was quite a process. I remember when they brought it into town, Dad told me, I said, well, I don't want you around here when we're unloading this. So I had to go down, and there was a place called Hamburger Jack's. This guy made hamburgers in a building that's no longer there. There were several buildings in Osage which were memorable. There, some of the names that we recall was John Spoon had a boarding house there. Indian Charlie was a Indian that lived in a little one, or no, it was Indian Savvy. That's who that was. And Nigger Charlie, that was his name. And some of the characters that were in Osage. Veer Smith had a hardware store there that I used to go in, and in fact I worked for him when I was in I guess probably in high school for a little bit. And we had a filling station, a Texaco filling station that Les and Dick Updike had. And Dick Updike was or Les Updike was our school bus driver. He had must have been a 35, 36 Chevy Coupe. And he was picking up Delbert's sister and brother and me and the two Gunderson girls, I think, brought them into school. And when it came time for me to ride, the car was full, so they made a little step right inside of the passenger door. And that was where I sat coming to school. There were some times when that road used to get pretty muddy, but Les always made it through in all the winters and everything. We started, when we moved to town, we had another company adventure, and I don't know the really details of this first well, that they had bought a rotary rig. That was just the first one in the country. And they set it up, it was drilling down at Dewey, and somebody had an idea that there should be an oil field down there. And we finished it up, drilled the well, and got water. Well, that was the end of that project. But then there was Ed Jones, who was one of the partners of this trust. He had the land out there where Tilly Sewell wound up. And he wanted to drill an oil well out there. He thought he was a geologist. And he had got Dad to move the rig up there and everything, and that was quite an undertaking. I wasn't around during that very much. Well, let's see, we got a couple of
She had to cough.
Yeah, no, somebody else is coming in the door. Oh, there's. So they moved that rig up there, and it was a steam rig. Had a boiler in it, and the boilers had a problem once in a while. If the boiler tender didn't keep water in the boiler, they were known to blow up because they get too hot, too much steam pressure. And I can remember it was on June 21st. I remember it because it was the longest day of the year. My dad and Gordon Polly went down there and they had to cut some steel out of that boiler that was blown up. And we were down there doing that. Well, then we moved that steam rig up to just outside Osage. And I think most of you probably have been out to the water well out there at one time or another. Well, they started drilling this well and everything was working well. And they got down in on the top of the Metallusa. And they drilled into that and they hit a drill pipe just dropped. They'd hit a cavern. Wow. Well, that Metallusa had so much pressure in it that it immediately started, unloaded the hole, pushed all the mud out of the hole. And Dad had told Ed Jones, you got to put another joint of surface pipe in there, because they only had one, probably 30-foot joint in there. Dad said, I've got a joint there and I'll give you. No, I said, I don't need it. Well, they did have a control valve on this well. And they tried shutting that in. Well, it immediately, on a rotary rig, you have your main hole that you drill, and then your Kelly, you have to have someplace to put that. So you have a rat hole, which you can run the Kelly down in the rat hole, and that frees up your traveling blocks to hoist casing or whatever you want to hoist with it, or to bring another joint in. Well, it immediately started coming up the rat hole. So they couldn't let it do that because it was going to wash away, that was a 4-legged steel derrick. It was going to wash away one leg of the derrick and then the whole thing came in. So they got Halliburton out. They moved in by that time because it was, the field was still developing. Well, they said, well, we can put some cement down there and plug it. There's a mixture of products. One is just Portland cement, which we're all familiar with. And then they have another product called Calceal. And this Calceal accelerates the setting of the cement. But you never know how much. And they call it devil's broth because it's so indeterminate what it'll do. Well, they went down there and they set this devil's broth and just above the formation. Well, there was so much pressure, and I was 6 years old, 40 or 7 maybe, and it was coming up all the way around the well. It would come right through the ground. It was just seeping all over. So they had to drill that out. Well, then the only solution was to run casing in it and just let it flow. Well, that in turn was a great benefit for the community, because what they did was they had a tractor and they bulldozed out the mud pit and they put gravel in that, and that became the best swimming hole in the country because there was this fresh water coming through at a constant 60 degrees temperature, and they built a couple bathhouses there, and it was really a community gathering place, for several years. We would ride our bicycles out from town and swim all at Dave, Pauly, and I would do that. We've a lot of stories about that water well. One time, Dave and I had our bicycles out there, and a storm came up. We were the only ones there. No lifeguards or anything in those days. And we had to get back to town. Well, what do we do with our bicycles? Well, we pushed them and cleaned out the mud and pushed it away and cleaned out the mud. And we were maybe 10 years old or something at the time I was. It was hard to get the bike very far, and we finally cut across the road and had a long sweep around this way. We decided to go straight up the hill where we knew Wilsey's lived up there, and got the bikes up there, and it was a real struggle, I'll tell you. Anyway, that was just another story about the mud out there in that shale. So we moved into town, and Dad he was going to have electricity, so we had a Kohler light plant. And that became my job from the time I was about 8 years old, to start that light plant every night. And all you had to do was you take a little squirt can and put a little gasoline in it. It ran on kerosene. And you'd put the little gasoline in there for primer and pull a lever up, and it would grab magnetically. And you'd use the power that was in the batteries to spin the light plant until it started making power, making electricity. And electricity ran to the house where you have your lights and very few outlets. But it was pretty good living then. Osage was a somewhat much more of a community than it is now. Although I estimate there was maybe a couple hundred people living there, but we had two grocery stores. One of them was quite a bit better than the other one. One of them was Harrisbarger. He kind of had a filling station, grocery store. And we had the gas station, which was less than Dick Updike. Schlusser, trying to remember his first name. Veer Smith had the hardware store. Hunters had the post office. And the Johnsons came in and took over the John Spoon restaurant, had that going. We had, at one time, 2 bars in town. Curly Butcher had one bar, and I can't remember the name of the other guy that had a bar. And it was a viable community, you know. The people were all neighbors and everything, but it was pretty orderly. Then the power company in 1947 decided they wanted to build a power plant there. And they knew they were going to have places for people to live. So they built 5 houses, as I remember, various places around town. And they even brought in a water line from town, from the well. So we had water. That was a big improvement over the whole thing. We had electricity that they brought in after they got the first part of the plant done. And so that's pretty much the notable things of the history. But to get back then to our family, well, there was a friend of Dad's named Mark Shin, the grandfather of Steve Shin. Steve Shin, isn't it, the lawyer here? Yeah. Mm-hmm. He was grandfather of him. And he ran this little sawmill up there, and he also had a problem with alcohol. But he'd go out in the trees and he'd be looking for timber to cut, and he developed a pretty good nose for bentonite. Well, he never had enough money to file a claim, so his dad would grubstake him. And they would file this claim together. And so Dad started accumulating some bentonite. Well, when he had bought that Lambie lease, there was a truck on it that had a bed, oil-filled bed. And I remember Carl Summers, who'd worked for Dad, on a Sunday afternoon, I think it was, we were sitting there in the house and talking about what we're going to do with that truck. And they speculated, well, we could put a dump box on it and use it to haul bentonite. The Baroid plant had a system where they would hire about, I'm going to say, 25 trucks during the summer, and they'd build a big stockpile that would last them all winter over a period of about 5 months or so in the summertime. And Dad said, well, we could put, you want to drive it? Well, we can put that truck on all bentonite. Well, it didn't take him long to figure out that this wasn't the most efficient operation. So the next year he made the bentonite company an offer. He said, you pay me by the ton for all the bentonite we bring in, and I'll manage the trucking and hire the trucking and the loading. Well, it became Mother's job to take care of all these truck tickets. And she did that for that couple of years. Well, Dad and Mark Shin had these bentonite claims, and Dad thought, well, maybe I ought to get a cat so we could strip those. And we never stripped very deep in those days. 10 feet was about the maximum for bentonite, because for two reasons. One, the efficiency of moving dirt, and the bentonite has a characteristic that when it gets so deep, it turns to blue. Well, that did not fit Baroid's calendars to have this blue bentonite. They went a lot on the color of it. And plus the test, it had to be tested so good. So Dad could strip this bentonite and he'd sell it to the company. Well, he formed a very close friendship with Al Harding, who had graduated from Colorado School of Mines in 1938, and he was sent up there to be the superintendent of that plant. And when he was transferred then to Los Angeles, and they sent another manager up there. Well, this other manager kind of, either he had direction from the company or what. Mother always thought it was because she had a lot of acquaintances, and she used to get cream from Tilly Sewell. All through the war years and everything, she would always have fresh cream. And she would give it to some of her close friends, you know, and never any money exchanged or anything else. It was just a friendship thing. So when this couple moved in there, why, Mother was going to be generous and give her some fresh cream. Well, how much is it? Mother said, no charge, I'll just give it to you. Well, that just didn't fit her program, you know, and so Mother quit giving her cream because, and she always said, well, that must be the reason that they quit buying bentonite from us. I'm not sure that it was, because it was probably from higher up. Well, essentially what Dad thought was, well, I'll start my own company. Well, to be truthful about it, he knew very little about running a bentonite plant. But he did have a good friend, and he was persuasive, as I said. And he had brought that, well, I neglected to tell you about that Jones lease. This lease was making 5 barrels a day out of 5 wells, about 400 to 500 feet deep. Well, we had started a program of heating those wells, and Dad and Gordon Pauley devised a heater where you could wrap nichrome wire around this heater, or this tool that you run in the well, bring a cable up to the surface, and that gave you the drilling line and the cable for 2 cables. And they built a generator, a charger power plant. It had a flathead Ford running a generator, and you could set that out there and let that run for, seemed like about 4 days was recommended time. And they'd heat that formation. Well, the Newcastle formation there is pretty cold. You know, when I say cold, its basic temperature of the ground is 60 degrees once you get down below the temperate change. And you'd leave that heat in there and it would melt all that paraffin that was stopping the oil. Well, he brought that lease from 5 barrels a day up to 50 barrels a day. And this was during the war. And Dad was very good about saving. And he had accumulated $100,000 by 1947 when they started on this. That was quite a bit of money then. But they still had to borrow some more money to build the bentonite plant. But Al Harding designed everything. He was a good engineer, and he knew the business from having worked in it. And so we went ahead. Well, I was 14 years old. I was just out of grade school. And it was my job to haul water. Dad had gotten the last 3/4 ton pickup to come into the state during the war, because he was in the oil business. You had a WPA, I believe, was the initials for War Production Board or something like that. I don't know. And they allocated that pickup to Dad. Well, he still had it, and I could drive it. I was big enough to drive in those days. In fact, I remember I got my first license at 15 because that was the first year that Wyoming required a license, was 1948. And George Wilcox was the patrolman, and he said, "Well, I've seen you driving enough. I guess I don't need to do a road test with you." But Dad had bought when he was working hauling for Baroid, he had bought a tractor called a Traxcavator, and he just revolutionized bentonite loading, because they always, before they'd used what we like to call a steam shovel. You know, it's got a dipper that goes out and gets a bucket. But it was pretty slow to load trucks with. Well, Dad got this Traxcavator that had about a 3 cubic yard bucket on it, and he could load a truck. He didn't load it himself. He had a good operator running it. They could load a truck out in just 5 minutes instead of taking 10, or something. And that was the first time that they'd ever hauled 1,000 ton in one day with all those trucks, because they were loading and getting them out of there so quick. And that was he was very innovative in doing things like that. And this goes back to his farm background, I guess. You learned to fix things and to do things. So that was the birth of our bentonite plant up in Moorcroft. And we had one fortunate happening. There was a company over in I think it was in Belle Fourche. It was either there or it was up in the Bighorn Basin. There was a company called Schundler. And these buildings in those days were tin buildings, but they were built around on a wood frame because nobody built steel buildings in those days. And they had a fire and burned up their plant. Well, we just happened to have a plant all ready to go, and we picked up, for 2 years, we picked up all their business until they got back, and that kept our business going. It really got it started. And then the bentonite business is just a whole other story, but how we've grown progressively to where our big product now is not for the oil field, but it's for cat litter, which most of you know what it is. It's makes a scoop cat litter. That pretty well concludes most of what I've got to tell you. I don't know if you got some questions or not.
That, you were talking about that pond that you'd swim in and stuff?
Yeah,
Was that the one where you were showing me where that culvert would just gush forever and you had a creek and everything
Yeah.
there?
Yeah.
Could you explain where that water comes from?
okay. You've all heard about the limestone up that way.
Mallow area, right?
Huh?
Is
That way, up on top.
Mike Morrison's there.
Well, that's the Madison limestone. And when the rain happens and it falls into that formation, why it is contained, and the deeper you go, the more pressure this behind it. And if it doesn't have an outlet, it just keeps building up pressure. There was a great deal of concern when I was in the legislature about Etsy. Etsy was going to build a coal pipeline from here, from Gillette area, down to, I think, Arkansas or Alabama, one of the two. They were going to ship powder, grind coal up and ship it by water. Well, this raised a lot of hackles. They said, oh, we're shipping our water out of there. We buy milk, and the water is cheaper than milk, so why should we pay, let them get our water? Well, the truth of the matter is that we had no use for the water beyond Newcastle drilled after the first well they drilled up there. Why, soon after that, Newcastle decided to drill a well, and they drilled number 1 water well, which is still flowing. And it became a source of water for the whole town.
that's the one on 85, is that right?
Uh,
The one just
no,
going north?
It's up by the city shop.
Okay,
It's
I know
right
which
there
one
by
you
the city
mean.
shop.
I got you.
And they
Up
were lucky
Summit.
they hit one of these, if you hit one of these caverns, or very porous area, well, you've got a heck of a good well. Now, when they drilled number 2 well, they didn't get it. It was right close, but it wasn't. And number 3 was drilled out in the park here, and it never really did amount to much. The refinery tried to drill a well, and they never could get a water well there at the refinery because of the change in the lithography of the formation.
And then Voss got one out by the fountain end, didn't he, then later?
Yeah, that was a good well too. Voss drilled one out there at the fountain end. And I think our last water well was pretty fair too. And for a long time, they were always afraid to shut in number 1 well because they weren't sure how good the pipe was and everything. And when I was on the council, I brought up the idea of pumping that water up to the tank. And I said, we can get so much water out of the well because we'll take that pressure head off from it and let it flow in. And that worked for a long time, but they kept thinking they needed more water, which I guess we do. So that's kind of the history of that well. Then when the power company used it for years, and let it run in. It kept the lake up there full and everything. And they later on, by a little better methods of control and everything, they were able to go in and actually plug that original well. And then they drilled another one that would keep the dam full, just as basically a community gesture, or for keep on with the circumstances.
Good place for recreation, people to boat and fish.
Know what?
A good place for recreation where they.
Well, yeah, it was at one time, well, it's still a good fishing hole, I guess.
That's what, about 1,000-foot elevation that it came from? Higher up? Something like that?
Well, it's more than that. It's probably almost 2,000 feet,
Wow.
which relates to about 1,000 pounds of pressure
That's
at
a
the bottom.
lot of difference, yeah.
And then coming up to the surface, you got to get it, but there's still quite a bit of pressure. They had a 7-inch, I think 7 or 8-inch pipe that was flowing out, and we could go there when we were swimming, and we could put our hands up over our head and pull our head back into that and holler into it, and made a kind of an echo chamber. The water would just all around you. And every once in a while, though, there'd be rocks come out of that.
Oh, that'd feel
Up
good.
with them. And didn't want to have your head there. But you could see some of the rocks would be laying around there.
When did Oil Town kind of start disappearing?
When did it what?
Start evaporating, the oil city? Just kind of people moving away and
Oil
stuff.
City was, but you were out there more than I was, Delbert. I would say that,
Well, they come in with water flooding in
yeah,
50.
yeah, in the 50s, they
50s.
started water flooding, and then they, Coronado Company, pretty much dominated it. And but George Kiesling was one of the last Townsends. Well, Chuck Townsend still lived out there. There was Bill and Wog Townsend and their dad and the Juliuses. I don't know when they all moved away. There were some other names out there.
Because you can still see the foundations all over the place out there.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And some of the old oil
Yeah,
wells and things like
it actually
that.
had streets.
Yeah.
Delbert lived just about a mile from where I was. Maybe it was about that far over to your house, wasn't it?
Well, probably, yeah.
Yeah.
Not much. Not much more than that, anyway.
So that's where Pat Townsend lives now,
Yeah, Pat lives in
That's-
Oil City.
Oil City.
Yeah. Yeah, Chuck just couldn't get away.
Mr. Thorson, how long has
They called
your,
me Mister.
just being respectful, sir. How long has your company, from the time your dad started it to now, have you ran continuously all that time?
All that time. I've been with the company 76 years. We just had our 75th anniversary last summer.
Wow.
And I can claim to have been involved with it for 76 years. It actually started in 1946 was when the concept started taking hold. Dad called Al Harding and said, "Why don't we meet up in the Bighorns up at Meadowlark Lake?" And this was the summer of '46, and we went up there, and I can remember renting a. They were a mother and dad and Al and Margaret were all in a cabin hashing out that. Mother came up with the name for Black Hills Bentonite. They didn't know what to call it, but she said, "How about Black Hills Bentonite?" And that stuck And I can remember us kids going out. I was the oldest, of course, and with a rowboat and a little outboard going out on the Metal Ark Lake.
And when we make a public records request and are told by a county clerk that they have to retrieve it from the vault and that's going to take 30 days, that absolutely should never ever be said to anybody.
Right. And why does it take however long to get the minutes put up on there so people can actually see the minutes, when in today's technology, it's as quick as, you copy it, you paste it on there, and you're done. It's really the update of our website. There's a lot of things that I said it in the city council meeting just a couple days ago. All of us as commissioners and city council members, in the past, they have kicked these problems down the road, and I can list 5 right off the top. The good doctor during COVID, dispatch, the contracts with dispatch, the costs that are incurred when it comes to these Title 25s. The hospitals asked for solutions for these things.
But I worked in the Bentonite all through high school. I was out drilling, surveying, running equipment. I had really started in the Bentonite when we were in Osage, in that mining period, why the holes would fill up with water, rain and stuff, and some groundwater come in. So that Bentonite, that water had to be pumped out. Well, that became my job, and I would sit there when I was, I think, probably 9 years old. I used to ride with Dad all the time that I could. I would stop along the road when we'd stop at the edge of the county road and wherever the pit rise. I would get out and walk with a shovel to fill in the chuck holes for the trucks on the road. And I would take care of that pump. It was a little 3-inch CMC pump. And Dad was a little leery about me being out there because he'd have stuff going on someplace else. I had to keep gasoline in that engine, and he was a little leery about me staying out there by myself, so he hired Fred Mooney. Fred was about 3 or 4 years older, I think, than I was. But he'd sit there and watch me do everything. I was riding home with Dad, and he said, I think we should fire him. He just lets me do all the work. But that's just the high school kids,
Another question. If it's not confidential information,
No.
would you have a rough idea in all this time how many tons of bentonite that you have?
Goodness.
I have no.
I just was curious if you had any idea.
I can tell you this, that at the present time, we ship 600,000 tons a year.
Oh my goodness.
Goes to Clorox.
At this time, you're shipping 600,000 tons.
Yeah, and it was down less than that. There was a period of time, we've got 3 plants in Casper and 1 in Worland. And then in 2000, we built the one up at Thornton, which is just north of Upton.
Yes.
Because we had accumulated, we formed our company reformed our company, I should say, in '65 when we moved to Casper. The bentonite became useful in the iron ore industry. Iron ore now, most of it, the good hematite deposits have pretty well become exhausted. And they have another rock called taconite. Well, taconite has got iron in it, but it's in particles too small to haul, So you have to crush the rock and run it across a magnet, which will pick up the iron particles, Well, then you have a bunch of very small iron particles. How do you handle them? You can't just pour them into a blast furnace or they go right on out. So if you mix about 6% bentonite, which is about 12 pounds per ton, with it and tumble it, I call it marbles. You make marbles out of it. Well, the marbles you can put in an ore boat, you can throw them into a blast furnace and whatever it was. Well, Bethlehem Steel was one of the largest processors of that. And they had gone out and filed on a lot of claims over, there's another bentonite, Black Hills was the kind of the start of the bentonite industry, because what had happened back in the Cretaceous years, which is about 200 million years ago, there was the ground, the formations were all pretty flat. They had to be, because there were a lot of ponds around, or shallow seas in the Cretaceous. That's in the dinosaur period. There were volcanoes up back towards Oregon and that area, and they would erupt and they'd send all this ash out, and this ash would settle down into these ponds, and then it was the natural geology progression. More sediments were added on top of this, and it kept building up, where now there's in some places several 3,000 or 4,000 feet above that layer. Well, through the process of weathering and heat and pressure, why that ash turned into what we know as bentonite. Well, then the uplift happened. The mountains the Black Hills were uplifted, and then the Bighorns were uplifted. And these formations were raised up, and then the erosion takes place, and it leaves outcrops, which you've seen this light-colored outcrops around. And that's where the bentonite is. And so we go in and mine these outcrops, and we strip back as far as we can to get the bentonite all that we can. And now we reformed our company. We made a partnership out of it, because we liked having a consumer as a partner, because then we didn't have to go out and hire a bunch of salesmen or anything else. And we were 49% of our company was Bethlehem Steel. And at one time, when the steel business got really bad, they said we were the only part of their company that made any money. But we've always had 51%, which gave us control, of course. And now we have a Japanese company that has 15% of our company. And we were just having a meeting with the owner of that here a week ago. Had come over from Japan, because he and my brother my brother ran the bentonite company for 50 years until he died. And I had the oil field out here that Dad and I had started. When I came back from the Army, I decided I'd rather do that working here than going off with a major. I had a job with Stanley Oil Company, but I wanted to stay here. And I say I had 30 years of fun, and about 5 years it got to be work, when all the government regulations just kept piling up. And that was one of my main reasons for selling the oil field when I did, was that the oil field regulations just got, I've worked people out there for 35 years, and the worst accident I had was one guy broke his arm because he had it in the wrong place.
Yeah.
But, never had any kind of a serious accident. And yet they have all these regulations for safety and everything that you've got to follow up with. And just because somebody has a thought of, well, that might be dangerous. Well, life is dangerous. And we always have to be on our guard about things happening. So that's kind of from my history, I guess you'd say.
Talk about the other partners you had through the years after Bethlehem.
Well, oh, okay. Yeah, we had Bethlehem sold their interest to Halliburton because Halliburton was making drilling mud. And Halliburton then merged with another company called Dresser Atlas, and they formed a company called Magmabar Fluids or some drilling fluids. Anyway, they were another bentonite company too. They had their own bentonite. And we were in business with our competitor, but they were supposed to take a share of our produce. Well, they'd use their own instead of taking ours.
Oh, man.
And so that didn't work out. Well, about this time, Tom had kind of hired a guy that he'd run into for doing some sales work, and we were making a product called granular, which is just bentonite that's about like sand, and it was going to Procter & Gamble, and they were using it in some of their soaps. Well, there was two guys down in Texas that were, I don't know what they were, one of them was a stockbroker, I don't know what the other one was, and they had an idea that they knew something about bentonite, that, hey, well, this makes good cat litter. Because when the cat urinates in it, it forms a clump. You know, the problem with a cat litter box is that the urine goes to the bottom, and what's it do? It sits there and stinks. Well, if you get it into a clump, you throw the clump out, and you throw out the stink. So they started in, they had we'd ship them truckloads of it. To start with, we'd have what we call super sacks. I'm sure you've seen them on a trailer. They're a sack about 4 feet high and 4 feet square that fit on a pallet, and we'd ship that down to them down in Houston. And they'd have hoppers, basically plywood hoppers, that would taper down to the bottom, and they'd have a valve on these, and they'd take milk cartons and fill these milk cartons up. Then they'd go to these cat shows, and these were pretty kind of high-toned, you know, people that, boy, they really went for that. Well, they built themselves a name, and First Brands got a hold of it. Well, First Brands is, I'm sure most of you remember Union Carbide. That was the consumer products brand of Union Carbide. Union Carbide had had a disaster in India with the Bhopal or some Bhopal fire that killed a lot of people, and they were trying to separate their consumer products from their base company. And so they picked that up. They also had STP and several other products that we commonly use. They were consumer products. And they paid them, I don't know, I think $20 million or something for this, because they patented this. And they had the patent on the cat litter. Well, that went into a lot of contention, and Colloid managed to get somehow or other get part of that to where we had both Colloid and us were selling this for cat litter. And they then they were doing pretty well, and then Clorox decided they wanted it, so they bought it from bought out First Brands, and they got everything that First Brands had, including our cat litter, and that's where we are today. Is Clorox is our partner. So it's always been beneficial to us that we have a consumer who takes a good part of our product. Now, there's another company that this guy in Denver is a veterinarian actually, and he started taking just little dabs of bentonite and selling. His name is Doc Elsey, and he calls it Precious Cat. And he started taking bentonite to where he set up if you ever go south of Cheyenne, well, there's a big green shed there, in that industrial park, and you'll see 3 elevators sticking up out of it. It's very prominent. And we're shipping a lot of bentonite to him now. And he's really built that company up. He just uses just pure bentonite. Now what Clorox does, because the freight is so high getting it back to Spring Hill, Missouri, where their packaging plant is, they mix powdered, or not powdered, but particle size limestone with the bentonite, and it doesn't really diminish the quality of the bentonite by having this limestone there, because the limestone is dirt cheap back there, you know. Everything is limestone all over the place, and so it's a smart thing for them to do. They can dilute it. Now they are doing a new process where we've always had a problem in our plants. You make a lot of dust, and you have dust collectors when you run it through the dryer and everything. But you have to, when you're selling for drilling mud, why that dust just goes into what's milled and you never notice it. But we didn't have anything to do, any way of getting rid of our dust. We were hauling it back to the pits sometimes, and so we could keep making the particle size. This particle size is a little bit bigger than sugar, you know, maybe twice the size of sugar, but it's all particles, and we screen it to get that. So we've come up with an idea that we use what we call a pin mill, which is just a deal about 8 feet long, and it has a spindle inside of it, and there's a bunch of pins sticking up out in a spiral. And you put the bentonite in with this, and you've got to measure your water pretty closely, and you come out with particles of bentonite, and you run these through the dryer, and they become solid bentonite that you can see again. Well, Clorox thought, well, carbon was a great odor reducer, and so they've got us to fix up a deal where we can mix powdered carbon in with this pin mill, and so it's really incorporated into the particle size. Now, if you just try to mix powdered carbon into dry bentonite, you can imagine what you would have. You would have carbon and bentonite.
It's kind of each particle needs to be combined with the carbon at
what
that
we
time,
do,
right?
and we're the only company that does this, that uses the pin mill and mixes carbon with it. So it's been very fortuitous for us that we have that method. It was kind of accidental that Clorox really come up with the carbon mixing.
Is that carbon coal dust?
No, it's not. It's carbon. Coal is primarily carbon, but it is not coal dust.
Oh, darn.
The carbon is pure carbon. And it's, it'll
So-
burn.
So those pinmills, it actually makes the carbon and the bentonite together in each
It mixes them
particle.
together and bakes them together. see,
So the
that it-
particles are not just one or the other, they're both
Right.
of them. Okay.
What?
What are they used for?
Used
Odor.
for?
Yeah.
Odor
Well,
control.
the carbon kills the odor
Oh, for the cat litter.
for the cat odor, see?
Okay.
Yeah. And Clorox is the only, now, Arm & Hammer tries to use baking soda for that. And they have a good publicity program, so they've managed to sell it on that basis. But it's not as effective as the carbon is.
Can you address the phrase food grade bentonite? Does your company?
No, we don't. Now, there's one company that does that I know of. And that happened. Well, I think that Raymond Noble Company over at Belle Fourche, I suspect that they went into that, but Colloid was making food grade carbon, and they had to really be particular how they handled that, because it took a whole different plant and everything, to maintain the purity.
So Black Hills Bentonite is not involved
No,
in that
we're
kind
not.
of?
We're not. Colloid is the only ones that do that, and I don't know if they still do. I'm sure they must. It's a niche product. Talking about niche products,
Some candy bars.
we were one time in one of these walk-through malls or something, and I saw this winemaking store, where they have all the accessories that you need for making wine. And I looked up on this board with this little 1 ounce packages, bentonite. It filters. It's used to filter the wine, because the alcohol doesn't make it swell, you see, and it filters, takes out the water. Well, 50 cents. You start figuring out $16,000 a ton.
Wow.
And we sell it for, well, we used to sell it for $20 a ton. Now it's gone up considerably, but
So are you making wine, Don?
no.
Maybe you should be.
Okay.
That's some versatile stuff.
Do you use bentonite in makeup? I've heard that. It's in makeup or something?
Bentonite is used in cosmetic products.
Is that anything that you do at all?
What?
They use some of your product, perhaps?
Probably not. We sell quite a bit for feed, cattle feed. They use bentonite to bind the grain particles together. When I was back at Hillsdale College, which I've gotten associated with, and they had a guy back there, and he said he was kind of an entrepreneur, and he was selling bentonite as a food product. And he said, it's a great, just a teaspoon a day is all you need. And talking about health benefits, well, it may have some. I have never tried using it,
Kind of like eating dirt.
but I can't say that it doesn't work.
Sprinkle it over your cereal.
Yeah.
Eat dirt.
So,
Thank you very much, Don.
well,
It's very
it's been
nice.
enjoyable and brings back a lot of memories to me. I use this book that Mother and And Mabel Brown wrote, and some of the dates, you know, that I needed were in there. I know most of the stories, but trying to put dates on them, I need a little help.
That was very, very interesting. Yes, very.
Thank you.
You know, there's one thing that I think would probably be interesting, about the muddy sand or the Newcastle sand that the oil to the west of us all came out of, and it outcrops right.
Yeah, right. Well, my house is built
Right,
on the same formation that I was producing oil out of.
and there's a spring right up
Right up
here, this
oil
side,
came
this
out
side
of
of the track. That,
Yeah, and Oil Creek out of Skull Creek was
right,
that's where it got its name.
but even where this uplift is that you were talking about, when you get to the fairground, that's 1,000 feet deep.
Yeah,
Where
it dives off pretty fast,
it dives off pretty fast.
and then it's kind of levels out.
Yeah. Well,
You know, and it becomes a gradual slope out of Mush Creek.
but you get out into the
4,000 feet.
the basin, it gets to 15,000.
Yeah,
So,
there's been a lot of stuff put on top of it.
right, come off the top of the hills.
There's a very good book that I read about geology, and you'd probably enjoy it. It's called How the Mountains Move, I think it is. That originally the globe, you know, was all water, I guess, and they started getting volcanic action and bring up land masses. The United States is composed of 7 different land masses that move around, and they've been apart and they come back together, just like you've looked on a globe, the difference, how Africa fits into South America.
Mm-hmm.
That has been together and it's separated, come together and separated again.
Mm.
This they can prove with microbiology. When they can find the same products, same formations in Africa that they have in Brazil or whatever. And they can find different occurrences of them, so they know that it had to been separated, and all the continents of the earth are still moving, which is what causes earthquakes now.
Well, thank you so much.
You're
Thank you,
welcome.
knowledge.
Yes.
Thank you for coming.
Definitely.
It's a good